Please be seated. And if you'd like to, please take your Bible and go over to Acts chapter 14 this morning, our first reading that Gail read to us. So, have you ever been mistaken for somebody else? Now, this may have happened to you if you were in Walmart or Costco or something like that. There's one time I was in Target years ago, and I had a red shirt on, and I had probably 3 people stop me and ask, "Hey, do you know where such and such is?" It's like, do I look like I work here? And I didn't remember what color shirt I had on. I did, in fact, look like I worked there. But another story I did, and before, because it involves my wife, I did get permission to use this one, so just putting that out there. When we were first dating, we were going to meet her family at a restaurant. It was somebody's birthday. And as we were walking up, this guy walked by us, and she goes, "Oh, hey, Gavin." He goes, "Hi." And she goes, "Well, how are you doing?" He's like, "I'm okay." And she's like, "Well, what?" He's like, "But I'm not Gavin." Now, at that point, most of us probably would have said, "Oh, I'm sorry," and moved on. But my wife is no quitter. So she looks at him and says, "Are you sure you're not Gavin?" "Yes, I'm not Gavin," he said. So, and I don't remember what his real name was, but after a brief interrogation, she finally conceded that he was not, in fact, Gavin, but he was someone else that we'd never met before. And we went on our way. And to this day, we have no earthly idea who Gavin is or what he looks like, but I know that he's not that guy. So, and most of us, like I said, have probably had an experience like that at one point or another, although they probably weren't, "Are you sure?" I mean, like you just forgot that day who you were. And this is such a common experience in life. It's become a literary device. It's a trope where characters in a story are mistaken for someone else. You remember Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. The whole premise is that idea. But before the Bard wrote his play, this was also a common feature in Greek comedy. And the playwrights used it often as a plot device in the ancient world. And what we find here this morning in the book of Acts, the portion that was read to us, is we see where Paul and Barnabas, as they're continuing their missionary journey, were also mistaken for someone else. And so we're going to see how this case of mistaken identity led them to reveal something about God's glory, but also about our own hearts. So in verse 8, we start this whole story with the man who listened. It says, "In Lystra, a man was sitting who was without strength in his feet. He had never walked, and he had been lame from birth. He listened as Paul spoke. After looking directly at him and seeing that he had faith to be healed, Paul said in a loud voice, 'Stand up on your feet.' And he jumped up and began to walk around." So if you remember a few weeks ago, we looked at how Paul and Barnabas' trip to Pisidian Antioch went, and where they met fierce opposition from the Jewish leaders of the synagogue. And as chapter 14 begins, we're told that the same thing happened to them again in Iconium. And this led to a split in the city between those who had seen the signs done by Paul and Barnabas and believed, and those who did not believe and sided with the Jewish leaders. And after a plot was hatched to stop them, Paul and Barnabas ended up fleeing the city. And as they continued their way down the road, we talked about that Roman military road that they were using, that had it been one of our roads, they'd still be working on it, much like I-65. But as they continued down this road, they came to a town called Lystra. And Lystra was a thriving market town that dealt heavily in different kinds of trade. Now, there was a Roman colony there at one time, but by this time when they arrived there, the Romans only made up a small percentage of that population. The residents of Lystra were given all the same rights as Roman citizens, however, because it started as a Roman colony. So they placed a high value on the power and authority of the empire in the culture of this city. Now, one thing we notice is that there doesn't seem to be a significant Jewish presence in Lystra. This is different from Pisidian Antioch and Iconium, where there was a strong Jewish presence. And there doesn't seem to be any synagogues or organized observances here at all. So Paul and Barnabas switched their method from how they normally approach these towns and that they used, such as they used previously. But here they employ a different method. They match their method to the culture around them and use the method known to Roman citizens as marketplace discourse. Now, for us, this is kind of a little bit different. We think of the people who stand on the street and start shouting at people to be just a little bit unhinged. But back in that time, the idea of a classroom or a lecture hall was common, but most philosophers of the higher classes went to the public sphere to share what they had to say. They did. In fact, there are some records of one philosopher criticizing another because he required people to come to a classroom to learn. The idea of keeping learning in a contained environment was totally foreign to this school of thought. For them, wisdom should be given freely and freely shared. And so Paul seems to adopt this method, and he begins to teach the gospel in a way that these people could understand through a method that they saw every day. Now, isn't that just something amazing about the gospel? That no matter where you are and what culture you're in, it's always relevant, and it always applies to whatever method you use to teach it. The gospel always resonates in the hearts of men, and the truth of it fills that aching void inside that they try to fill with sin and brokenness. And though in our day it may be discouraging to look at our world and see the decidedly anti-Christian turn that Western society has taken, we don't need to give up hope. Because things like this still happen. We just need to adapt. In places beyond our sight, the gospel is still connecting. In the Congo, Bishop William is up to his eyeballs in work because despite the violent and terrible humanitarian crisis that's going on over there, God is doing a great work of renewal. A few weeks ago, another new church opened. And as Bishop David told us, there were 38 new priests ordained to the gospel ministry. They can't ordain them fast enough because the work is growing there. There are people running to the word of the gospel because despite the evil and brokenness these people have suffered, the good news is still the good news. In any context, in any time, in any way, Jesus still saves sinners. It's also interesting that Paul understood this. And he didn't just keep doing the same old thing. He didn't look at it and say, oh, well, they don't have a synagogue. I guess I got to pack up and move on. No. If he wasn't so dependent on keeping the message to people who looked like him and thought like him, he decided to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles in that market city because he knew the gospel still has the power to save. The thing is, we must be the ones to share it. And we can't lock ourselves into these little boxes of tradition. Like the synagogue leaders in Antioch, we can get locked into the idea that the only way works is our way, or the way we've always done it. And we can lose sight of the new things that God is doing. The way you present the gospel will probably be different from one person to the next. You don't share the gospel the same to a highly educated, doctorate level adult as you do to a little child. We adapt for every aspect of our culture. And some may receive it better than others. Some people receive it when they first hear it. Some people, it takes years. But the gospel is still the gospel. And we're still called to be all things to all people. Not just the ones who fit our methodology. Not just the ones who look like us and think like us and sound like us. And as a result of this holy flexibility of Paul, God's Spirit moved. And we see what happened here. A man who was there had been disabled from birth, which, as we've talked about before, in the ancient world, they typically thought that meant this person was cursed for something he or his ancestors had done. But as Paul looks at him, he calls him to stand up, much like Peter did all those chapters ago. And that man stood up, and he started to celebrate. And not only that, but all this crowd that had gathered around in this market watched it and saw what happened, and they took notice. And this crowded area where this man probably sat time and again, that could have been his regular spot for years. Someone they probably stepped over and ignored again and again, just stood up for the first time, and suddenly they noticed him. And they're in awe because this is amazing. But that is when the trouble begins. It's always when the good things happen that the troubles start coming, because the man who listened was suddenly made whole, and the Lycaonians' perspective toward Paul and Barnabas suddenly changed. And they thought that this miracle for the man who listened was based on the men who spoke. Number 2, we look at verse 11. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. So all of these people gathered here turn over and they look, and they see these two strange Jewish men standing there, and a miracle had just taken place. And they began to speak to each other, and Paul and Barnabas didn't speak the same language, so they didn't know what was going on over here. And a deep misunderstanding arose about these two missionaries. They thought that the gods had come to visit them. Now, this to us may seem to be a bit of a comedic overreach, and as I'm sure as Luke was writing this down, he probably was getting a good chuckle out of this on Paul and Barnabas' expense. But thinking of how they tried to figure out these were gods or not. But in the ancient world, the idea of gods being among men was not a comedic idea or a fiction. They thought that this was something that happened quite often. For instance, the Roman emperor who controlled that colony in that area, he was considered a god in human form, ruling over the empire. This is why they had temples devoted to worshiping the empire, where they would pledge their allegiance by worshiping and declaring Caesar is Lord. Now, in particular, this town was influenced by Roman gods. There was a temple to Zeus just outside the city limits, which has an unusual story around it that explains why they came to this conclusion. You see, there's an ancient story where Zeus and Hermes disguised themselves as men, and they went out to visit a city in this area. And they tried to find somebody who would take them in. But one after the other, the doors were shut in their face. And finally, they came to this couple at the back end of the town in a rundown shack, and they finally brought them in and showed them hospitality. And as the story goes, as a result of this, Zeus and Hermes rewarded them by making their home into a temple and this couple into a priest and priestess. But he destroyed the rest of the city for not accepting them. And now this myth is very similar to the story we find in Genesis, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the angels had sought to find 10 righteous people, but found none who would treat them properly. And so the entire city was destroyed. And so with all that in mind, these Lycaonians did not want to leave anything to chance, because they didn't want that to happen again. That, to us, this is a quaint story or a myth. To them, this was history, religious history. And so when they saw this supernatural event happen, they thought they knew it was divine intervention, but they had the wrong God to perform it. And their assumption is, since Barnabas was accompanied by one who seemed to do all the talking, then it must be Zeus and Hermes, because Hermes was the spokesperson for the gods in the Roman pantheon. And so the problem is, with this whole thing, is Paul had no clue what was going on. He was clueless. And as they're standing there, they're watching these people. He's probably still preaching. You know how Paul is. And so he's walking, and then all of a sudden, a priest starts walking in with a trail of oxen behind him out of the temple. And they're ready to start sacrificing. And then he realizes what's going on here. And the great mistake they'd made. Because here they were giving glory to man and not to God. And so there's a crossroads here. Because there's two ways this could have played out. They could have let it ride as it was. Try to make their way out of the city before things got out of hand. They could have let the sacrifices happen. At least they would have got a free meal out of it. They could have taken, by the way, can we just stop to appreciate the fact that this priest was so ready to just come dragging a bunch of oxen out to go sacrifice them in the market square? I mean, that's really thinking ahead. Anyway, they could take whatever money was offered. The people didn't need to know the difference, and they likely never would. But this was something Paul could not do. He could not take the glory that belonged to God. It would be theft and idolatry if he'd done that. He could not let that stand. Because these people had to understand that man was not healed by their power, but by the God of Israel. The God who takes away the sins of the world, who loves them far beyond anything they could ever comprehend, far beyond what they ever think about these gods that they had. You see, they needed the gospel, not supermen. They need Jesus, not just what he can give them. They had a choice to go the way of pride, as Herod did, and we saw several weeks ago, or to go the way of Jesus, the way of humility. Now, these days we think that these kinds of decisions are limited to cult leaders and crazy false messiahs who come to people and promise them that as long as they hold to the way that they think it works, it'll all be good. But it's not just that, is it? It's not just the Jim Joneses, the Charles Mansons, and all those people of the world. We see this kind of thing. Because in our culture, we have a much larger and much stronger cult, the cult of celebrity. And if you look out, we can see that the power that celebrities and stars have in the world around us, they have the power to influence the market and entertainment, social trends, and even in some cases, politics. And as they're seen as they grow in this power as more than human, greater than just mortal. And it's not just in the secular world, it's also in Christianity. Because there's Christian superstars. We have Christian preachers and celebrities. And we confuse God's blessing on their ministry for their own ability. And we hide behind the admiration. Hiding behind this admiration is the same temptation to rob God of his glory. It's easy for us to look at these men and women as more than mortal, as stained glass saints walking among us. But that's not who they really are. And if we're not careful, we can begin to believe it. And if they're not careful, they can begin to believe it. And some of them do. Why do you think it is that every time when a scandal comes out, something they did, that they're so quick to hide it, so quick to brush it away, so quick to hire lawyers to get rid of the victims? Look at the ones who rise so high that they crash and burn so hard. We know the stories of the Willow Creek situation, the Hillsong situation, Coral Ridge Presbyterian. Great people, great places that have fallen to pride. And for us, we must remember not to put people on pedestals. We cannot put people in the place of God. We can't put them on a pedestal so they're so high above us. Now, we all have gifted preachers and teachers and writers that we enjoy their material. It edifies us, it helps us, it builds us up. But we must be so careful to remember that every gifting has a giver behind it. That God gave that gift to grow your faith and relationship with him. He did not give, he gave it to grow with you, to grow in relationship with you, not for you to grow in relationship with a radio preacher or internet teacher. Because men will always let you down. Every time. And when men go to steal God's glory, they've already let you down. So let's not have a case of mistaken identity. We must remember it's all God's doing. Maybe not to this extreme, but how Paul reacted as he tore his clothes, sign of mourning and distress, and he pleads with them to realize we are just mortal men. No, and he shares with them the story of God and how he's the originator of all life, the giver of all blessings, and the one who left a witness to them. Now, in this instance, we don't hear him and the Jewish leaders from Antioch and Iconium come in and they interrupt this whole thing that Paul's doing. But later in the chapter, if you read on, we see that they're dragged out of the city and thought to be dead. But then Paul does something that no false teacher, no person out there for pride, no person out there for power would ever do. After they stoned him, he got up and he went back in. There's a man who has no pride. There's a man who's not building himself up. Because as they start throwing rocks at you, how many of us would honestly go back? There's a man who's doing something for a reason greater than we can understand. Because the Holy Spirit's in him and pulling him on. It says when they returned back to Antioch after they got out of that situation, they went to Antioch in Syria. And it says when they relayed all that God had done with them and how he opened the door to the Gentiles. Now, what we learn from this is God always honors ministry done for the right reasons. He moves powerfully through humble people. He's healing, renewing hearts, rescuing people from their sin. And the crazy thing is, most of what he's doing, we don't get to see. They don't make it on TV. They don't make it on YouTube. And I really think it's better that way. God's work, glory is for him, and he's working in small pockets. We need to understand, despite what maybe some of these people might think, despite what our culture has programmed us to think about celebrities with a large following, we cannot save anyone. No one can save anyone. Only God can. And he's not looking for someone with the biggest platform. He's not looking for somebody who can build the biggest empire. He's looking for the kind of humble people who realize that they are nothing without him. That it's not about their gifting, it's about the one who gives it. He's looking for people to partner with him on the front lines, not a pedestal, to push back the darkness. He's looking for people to pray for healing, pray for renewal, to work for the reconciliation in our world. And the best part is, you don't have to be a gifted person to do it. You don't have to have a certain level of charisma to do it. You just need to be obedient. We can avoid this whole mess that Paul's doing if we remember that it's not about us and what we can do, but it's about what God has done through Jesus. It's not about our identity, our ability. It's about our identity. It's not about what we can do. It's about what God can do through us. It's about who God is, not who we are. And if we do that, I wonder what we would see God do. Now, don't go out expecting to be the next Billy Graham. That kind of defeats the whole celebrity thing. Maybe it'll be better than that. Maybe it won't be an auditorium. Maybe it won't be an arena. Maybe it won't be hundreds of thousands of people. Maybe it'll be better. Maybe it's that one person you've been praying for years, that one person that you've loved for so long, that person with cancer, that person who's lost a child, that person who's lost a parent, that person who's hurting. And you get to be the vehicle of God's grace to that person who needs to hear the gospel, who's lost in addiction, lost in sexual brokenness, lost everything in their house. They've sought their house, their car, their job, lost everything, and suddenly they hear that all things can be made new in Jesus, that all that stuff means nothing, but Jesus is everything. You can be that person. You don't have to be gifted. You don't have to be a celebrity. Just be faithful. If you'll be who God's calling you to be, then that's the best you could ever hope for. And there's no mistaken identity about that. Amen? Amen. Please stand.